Hello and welcome to the Pharmacy Informatics Professor 2020 with your host, Dr. Armin Simonian. In this day and age of electronic health records, CPOE, and e-prescribing, we still have a lot of orders that are done on paper. And why is that? Well, certain orders are very complicated, especially in the acute care setting. A good example is total parenteral nutrition, or TPN orders, and the accompanying TNA, total nutritional admixture orders for neonates. When we look at TPN, if you've studied pharmacy math recently, you know that there are a lot of steps involved with determining the TPN solution for an adult. You have to calculate the BEE, basal energy expenditure, or total energy expenditure, depending on the disease state. And then you have to pay attention to how much fluid is needed for the patient. There's a calculation for that too. And then you have to determine the ingredients and how you're going to meet the caloric intake for that patient. So the amount of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats that will be added into the solution. And then we have our ingredients, our electrolytes and micronutrients that have to be added also. And some of those ingredients get complicated. A good example is potassium phosphate, where you have potassium and phosphate provided in the same product, the same vial. And the potassium is measured in MEQs and the phosphate is measured in millimoles. And that becomes a challenge with ordering and determining the amount of each electrolyte. And you almost need a separate app or a smart form for doing TPN order entry. And this is why it's been a challenge. And even though we started implementing CPOE 20 years ago, we still to this day have a lot of TPN orders that are done on paper and then entered into the computer system. This is also very true for TNA, as I mentioned. So for our neonates, if you have a newborn premature that weighs 1 kilo or less and can fit in the palm of your hand, you can imagine that fluid intake has to be measured really down to the 10th of an ml and tracked very closely. And that includes all medications, all intake. And when it comes to feeding through the vein with a TNA, we have to really pay attention to the amount of fluid that's allowed for that very small child, that very small newborn to be able to take. And we have to take into account concentration of the fluid. We have to pay attention to little details like how much fluid overfill that we need to put into the TNA to fill the tubing, to prime the tubing. And it gets very complicated. So the other part of it that I will mention is clinical decision support. So when we're making a TPN solution, we have to pay close attention to the calcium phosphate compatibility curve. So depending on how much calcium ion and phosphate ion is in the solution, if it gets too high of either component or both components, we can have a precipitate forming within the TPN solution, and that's very dangerous. We don't want that to happen. And so we do have specialized programs that can calculate that curve and where we are on that curve and suggest an adjustment to those electrolytes. But in the electronic health record, where you don't have a special app and specialized CDSS for doing that calculation, that can also become a problem. So we see that it's not really straightforward with entering TPN and TNA orders, and a lot of those, even today, are still done on paper and then entered into the computer. And this episode today is a Journal Club episode, and what I found is another problem area for CPOE, and that is chemotherapy orders. So there are a lot of challenges, different challenges, unique challenges with chemotherapy. And our EHR vendors have been challenged with trying to create apps or smart forms or specialized applications integrated within their EHR to provide a good way of entering chemotherapy orders. So I ran across an article that addressed this, and I wanted to talk about that article specifically. Let me bring up my screen and we will get into this journal club presentation. And this one today is on chemotherapy orders. So this is the article, Conversion from Paper to Electronic Acute Care Chemotherapy Orders. And this was published last year in 2020. And chemotherapy. So as we know, there are a lot of challenges with chemotherapy. We dose our chemotherapy and then we schedule cycles often. So it's not just one course of therapy, but we give a course of therapy. We allow the patient to recover in terms of white blood count, and then we go ahead and give the next round of therapy. And you can also often have 4 to 6 cycles of chemo. The sequence of administration is very important. So with chemotherapy, it's not just giving the chemo drug, it's pre-meds. So you'll give some fluid ahead of time. You might give some medications to prophylactically guard against chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. And then we actually give the chemotherapy, and then we might give an adjuvant therapy. So if we're giving ifosfamide therapy, then we also have to consider giving the mesna and where that fits in terms of the sequence. And then after those chemo drugs are put into the patient, then we have post-meds and fluids that are given. And then for certain drugs, you also have to pay attention to the lifetime max dose. So if they're repeating cycles and then for some reason they have to come back and have a recurrence of the tumor, then we have to go in and treat again. And so it's important within our EHRs to keep track of lifetime max doses. So because of all of these, you almost need a flow chart every time the patient comes in to make sure that all the fluids and meds are given in the right sequence. And then those are reordered in the right dose for the next round of therapy when the patient comes back in a few weeks. And we keep track of how many cycles they've had, and it becomes very complicated. So you can imagine we need a smart form, we need a special app really for effective chemotherapy CPOE. And in this article, they talked about implementing a system, and they didn't get into the details so much about how they handle all of these different aspects of the challenges of chemotherapy CPOE, but they did talk about what it takes to get this job done. So as I mentioned, paper ordering still exists. This one institution was able to transition to CPOE for their chemotherapy. And the points that they make that I took away from this article is it takes a team. So you need the pharmacy informaticists, you need the medical informaticists and the clinical nurse informaticists. You need the frontline clinicians to be involved to make sure that this is going to work for them. And anyone prescribing chemotherapy, the oncologists, we have to make sure that they are finding that the app or the workflow is not too much of a hindrance and really helps them with prescribing of the medications, and is pretty straightforward, as straightforward as prescribing on paper, so that the transition can be done fairly easily and quickly. And then we also have to have our vendors involved. So as I mentioned at the start, it's been a challenge for our EHR vendors to have these applications built into their systems, but we're getting there. They've done a lot of work, and now we're at the point where we can actually transition from paper to CPOE for chemotherapy. And then You know, we're always looking for pharmacy informatics to provide safer and more effective medication therapy. And this is what they found with implementing this chemotherapy CPOE. And really, it took having the EHR in place, CPOE in place, clinical decision support in place, and working in integrated fashion. And then once you have all of those main components, as we've talked about in the past, then you can move forward with providing some specialized order entry templates, order sets, flow charts, or apps, and really be able to provide a good method for chemotherapy orders within our systems. And hopefully we're getting there also, as I mentioned before, with TPN and TNA orders. So interesting article, and good to read that and get an idea of some of the challenges that still exist today with converting from paper to electronic ordering. And if this was interesting for you, please like the video and subscribe to my channel, and I'll thank you for that. And in the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, look after the health of others, and I'll continue to work on more Journal Club and other episodes, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.